So, get started. Some of you know that we've published a book, Doug Scott and I, who is right back here, Bullet Strikes on the First Day of the American Revolution, which Stuart was kind enough to publish for us. And in there we talk about the remaining battle damage, residue of the battle, which are musket ball and fowling piece strikes from April 19th, 1775. But in order to get to the bullet strikes, we've got to talk about a few other things first, which are the arms. Well, I'm going to talk about how we got started on this craziness, the arms, as well as ammunition. Then I'll get into the bullet strikes, because all that stuff is important in deciding what's British, what's provincial, and what is a bullet strike and what isn't. So our work on the bullet strike started with archaeology at Minuteman National Park, at the Parker's Revenge Project, which most of you visited the other day, and that's where I met Doug Scott. I was a volunteer on the project and was able to learn about proper methodologies in archaeology and metal detecting. And we spent 2 years out there working and finding musket balls and fowling piece balls, which actually helped tell us about the battle, which is what was interpreted to you during the visit. But during that project, Doug and I talked about how great it would be to do live fire studies to better understand the musket balls we're finding and markings on the musket balls we're finding. So we took all the repro guns that I had custom built by Eric Goldstein at Williamsburg, Richard Colton, and a few from Kit Ravenshire. I'd been collecting them for a while. And we drove down to Georgia and set up a live fire study. And during that live fire study, we had Doppler radar set up, we had high-speed cameras, so we could figure the muzzle velocities of the guns as we were shooting. And we were able to publish 3 reports, which the first one was on a bunch of the different smoothbore arms. The second one, we threw in a little bit of Civil War stuff, even though that wasn't our primary goal. And then the last one, which was partially funded by the American Society of Arms Collectors Foundation, was a validation study of the bullet strike, shooting at wooden structures and recording the damage. And these are all published by the kindness of the American Society on the website. So if you go to the resources page, all 3 papers are there. If you feel like really getting in depth with smoothbore musket, ballistics, and want to take a great nap. Now, actually, I think it's real exciting. So what we were able to do, and I hope this works, is, yay, the video works. Thanks, Frank. Is use the high-speed cameras. We used a Phantom camera, which is a great camera. And we were able to, in slow motion, get the lock, how it functions. You can see the spark igniting the powder in the pan. This is all just the powder in the pan. In a few seconds, you'll see the charge actually ignite. But the camera system that we were using enabled us to get some fantastic video. And the charge is going to go off in just a second. You'll see the flame shoot out of the vent. There it goes. Boom. So this one was a double ball load. We were trying to study 2 musket balls that survived from the Boston Massacre, the only 2 artifacts, and see if they actually fired in brace or single, which we're able to figure out they fired singly, not in brace, and it was not a lot of fun to shoot those 2 balls out of this gun. So one of the things we have to take into consideration when we're talking about smoothbore guns, and a lot of guys who shoot modern guns don't understand this, is windage, okay? The ball that gets loaded into the gun is smaller than the bore itself. It's not like today where you have 9mm is a 9mm. So when you're firing, say, a British land pattern musket with a bore between .76 and .82, most of the time it's firing a smaller size ball. And that was great for when you're loading a lot of balls in combat into a fouled gun, but it's not that great for accuracy. And in this 1855, The Theory of Musketry, Major Kennedy writes, "A musket ball loaded with round ball, which by its own weight would rest upon the bottom of the bore. When the piece was held at the present, and being smaller than the bore, there would be windage, or a certain space left above the ball." So in order to illustrate that, we had illustrations done. And the top cutaway shows the loaded ball with cartridge paper on the powder charge. And at the top of it, there's a little bit of a gap. That's filled with paper. So, as Major Kennedy says, by gravity, when you load that ball and you go to the present, the ball sits on the bottom of the barrel. When you pull the trigger and the flint strikes the hammer and the spark ignites the charge, you can see in the bottom drawing that gases escape over the top of the ball, pushing some of the paper out. And what happens is, in some instances, the bottom of the ball will scrape the bore and ride it all the way out of the gun. So here's a video which shows the effects of windage. And it's a fouling piece that we fired. All that's coming out right now is just from the windage. So there's a lot of escaping gases that help drop the velocity of the ball. And there's the ball coming out. So as it comes out and it catches up with what initially came out from the windage, you'll start to see some little bits of linen cartridge paper go by that were from the windage, and then the ball will go by. It's very small, it's a fouling piece, so it's a 58 caliber ball. You can just see it when it goes past the tree there, with some of the other cartridge paper. So windage is important because you're losing velocity and you're losing accuracy because of the way the ball comes out of a smoothbore gun. And here's a ball that was found on a project we did at the North Bridge. A lot of you guys were down there the other day. And a couple of years ago, we did a project that was, it was actually released to the newspapers in July. And they used a picture of this ball. Not that this is in my hand, not the one that they used, but many people who looked at it said that this ball, you guys are idiots, this ball was not fired. It was just dropped on the ground. But if you look at this ball, you can see the results of the windage. And if you look at, see this line, these lines right here? That's called compression banding. That's where it rode the bore all the way out of the gun. So that ball was fired, but it reached its terminal velocity and landed in the soft ground. And more than likely, it came from a fouling piece, and it was fired from the west side of the North Bridge and landed on the east side. The provincials were known to be firing a little bit high in the rear ranks so they didn't hit their own men. So that ball was probably fired from a few ranks back and ended up just landing on the soft ground along with the 4 other ones we found. And 2 out of the 5 had really nice compression banding lines on them like this one. So the British arms are a little bit easier to understand than the provincial. They're either using the pattern 1769 Shortland with a barrel length of 42 inches, or the pattern 56 Longland musket with a 46-inch barrel. Now, we also did a bore study of original guns to better understand them. You talk to most people and they'll say, no, they're all .75 caliber. They're not. The way that the barrels were made was from flat stock and welded around a mandrel, so they all vary a little bit. So they all are between .75, .76, and about .82, although Mahler recorded a few British muskets that were about .84. So it's, while not a huge difference, it is a big difference when you're talking about the ammunition that goes into it and windage. And then you have a few officers' fusils and carbines with NCOs that would have been carried by, as mentioned, the NCOs and officers, but they're fewer than the enlisted men. So this would be the major gun that would have been carried that day. And one example survives. This particular example was captured after the fight on Lexington Green. It's a pattern 1756, marked to the 43rd Regiment of Foot. And this particular grenadier happened to be drunk when he marched out from Boston, and he trailed along behind the column and was captured by one of Captain John Parker's men. Now, the gun says it was captured by Captain John Parker, but it was not. It was another guy in his company named Joshua Simmons, and he wrote an account of it, and that he captured this guy that was 6 feet tall, and that he had been taken by liquor. So this is the first British soldier captured on April 19th. And while studying this, I was doing a presentation during COVID for this group, And I was going through some of my documents that I had found from the Massachusetts Archives collection, and I had a list of prisoners, British prisoners who were in the Concord jail. And I started looking at the list, and I forgot at the time that it had regiments listed. So we know that gun is a pattern 56, and we know it was carried by someone from the 43rd Regiment of Foot. And there's two members of the 43rd. You have Samuel Colton down here, and you have Duncan MacDonald. Well, working with Don Haggist, who's a researcher of British, all things British paper-wise, he pulled the muster rolls, and it turns out that the only grenadier captured on April 19th was Duncan MacDonald. So he's our drunken grenadier. So, and I'm not going to throw stones. I've been known to drink too. Anyway, so we have, I know, it's hard to believe. But in order to also understand the bullet strikes that we're going to talk about, we have to talk about the balls, the British musket balls. So you can see that this is where we got a little bit of screw up from the translation between PC and Apple. Things got a little bit jumbled here and there. But government allows 11 bullets to the pound for proof of muskets and 14 in the pound for service. And 14 in the pound equals .693. Now, were all the British musket balls .693? No. So how do we know that? We've looked at a lot of balls. We have not only looked at all of the balls found archaeologically at Minuteman, whether it was through the National Park Service or local historical societies, but we've gone to Ticonderoga where they have 12 trays of these things and gone through and recorded and weighed so we can calculate what the British musket balls actually were. And they range between .67 and .72 with an average of .68. The ball on the upper right was pulled out of the Merritt Monroe house in Lexington, right across Lexington Green. It was fired in the afternoon. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And the lower one was actually one we used as a sample. It came from a bunch that were taken from a British fort site. We know it was only occupied by the British during the Revolution, so we used some of those balls found as a sample. But understanding the arms used, provincial arms are all over the place. They're using a lot of different types of guns. This is an example that's in the Concord Museum collection. It's a long fowling piece carried by Robert Chaffin from Acton, next town up from Concord. It has a .64-inch bore, 55-inch barrel, so it's a really long gun. But this gun was either built for or adapted to fit a bayonet. So you can see the lower picture where it's got a bayonet lug on the bottom so that he could use it for his hunting or for his militia use. Here are three other examples. The top one was Corporal Roger Brown from Framingham, Massachusetts. That gun is in the Concord Museum collection. It was later half-stocked. And like many of these guns, they were converted to percussion a lot of times, and sometimes badly converted back. So the top gun and the middle gun were both converted and then reconverted again, but their bones are April 19th. The middle gun is the gun that was carried by Captain John Parker on the morning of the 19th, and that's in the state collection of Massachusetts. The barrel was shortened, but it was interesting because with a .64-inch bore, it probably fired about a .58-inch ball, and when we did the Parker's Revenge project, we found ball on the ground there, or in the ground, that could have fit in the bore of that gun. So not that it was from that gun, but it was kind of cool that it could have fit into it. And the lower piece is Samuel Dakin of Lincoln, Massachusetts, and that has a really small bore, which is about a ½ inch. So that you can see the range in ammunition that they're using. And the British mentioned some of the guns that they're carrying. These fellows are generally good marksmen, and many of them used long guns made for duck shooting, so they're talking about fowling pieces. And another British officer mentioned at Bunker Hill, their firelocks are very long, some near 7 feet. And these two balls that you see that I threw in the image, that top one has awesome compression banding from scraping the barrel on the way out of the gun. These are both from projects we did at Minuteman National Park. British also published things in the newspaper. This was actually published in an English newspaper, made its way to America, and then was reprinted in December of 1774 in a Massachusetts paper. It says, besides the regular trained militia in New England, all the planters' sons and servants are taught use of the fowling piece from their youth, and generally fire single balls with great exactness at fowl or beast. A gentleman well acquainted with that country is confident that the four provinces can muster upwards of 12,000 of these marksmen in 48 hours. Now, the marksman part is probably a little bit exaggerated, but they weren't far off on how many they could raise by the siege of Boston, because by April 23rd, there were 23,000 men around Boston besieging the British. This particular fowling piece below was converted to percussion. It was carried by Captain David Brown of Concord, Mass. And Captain David Brown's house was just on the west side of the North Bridge. So he literally fought in his own front yard on April 19th. Now, I don't know whether any of you saw the article that I wrote in American Rifleman about the guns of April 19th. This particular gun is in there, and I received many comments from people telling me that I'm stupid and that this gun was manufactured in 1840 because it's percussion, and you don't know what you're talking about. So it was converted to percussion, but this gun is a great New England parts gun built out of just about everything. And speaking of parts guns, here's another one in the Fort Ticonderoga collection. It was carried by John Gordon of Stowe, Massachusetts, and he marched on April 19th. Stowe didn't make it to the fight in time, but they took part in the siege of Boston, and he was mortally wounded and died during the Battle of Bunker Hill. But if you look at that gun, it's got probably a French fowling piece barrel, an early French lock, some other French parts to it, and a great maple stock. It's just a typical New England, Massachusetts parts gun. The other types of guns that were being used by provincials were old French arms, probably 1728s. Here's an example, lost at the Battle of Menominee by Nathan Putnam, who was from Danvers. He was badly wounded. He was shot in the right shoulder, a French firelock, marked D number 6, with a marking iron on the breech. Said Putnam carried it to a crossroads near a mill. That was in the modern-day town of Arlington, Mass. Whoever has said gun in possession desired to return it to Colonel Mansfield of Lynn or to the selectmen of Danvers. Now, I know that that gun did not get returned because in spending 10 years going through all the Massachusetts Archives records, I found the receipt of him being paid for that gun and for his wounds. He was very badly wounded, but he never got his French musket back. And Don Troiani was kind enough to let us use an image of his 1728. But that would have been a common gun. There were many, many of those captured during the French and Indian War and afterwards that were being sold in Boston by the chest. So there were probably a lot more of these guns out there, maybe not as many as the fowling pieces. The other thing that was around, but in smaller numbers, everybody thinks that all the provincials are carrying the same guns as the British, and they're not. The last shipment of King's military arms came over in 1755. There were 2,000 of them. Massachusetts also bought 500 Wilson muskets. But the 2,000 that came over were quickly issued in 1756 for Crown Point. And a lot of those were taken by the men and vanished. So there would have been a few in private hands. But these were province stocks, so they were to be returned and put back into stores. So some of them did escape and some of them would have been carried, but a lot of these still would have been at Castle Island under British protection after 1774 when the arms embargo happened. They didn't want the provincials getting these guns. And a great example of a company is this one. The bullets per pound in each gun carries in Captain Turner's company. And if you look at that list, you can see the 12 ball per pound, 13, 14, and the bigger bore size. But then when you get into the 20, 22, 24, 26, those are all more than likely fowling pieces. So in this company, there was a lot of fowling pieces and less military arms. So now we get into the bullet strikes. I went back to the Arlington Historical Society, which the headquarters is in the Jason Russell House in Arlington. And that house, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, has a lot of bullet holes in it. And I was visiting there, seeing some friends and looking at some artifacts. And I went through the house again. And after all the bullet strike stuff Doug and I had been doing, started to look at things differently. It's like, well, if a bullet went through here, then it had to hit here. And all of a sudden, going through the house, we started to find a lot more bullet holes than anybody ever knew were there. So I called Doug, and always up for a fun time, said, "Do you want to do a study of this stuff?" We were just going to do the Jason Russell house. And he's like, "Of course." So we set up, there was an archaeology conference in Boston, and we set up to go to the Jason Russell house and study it. But in order to do this, I'm going to do it in the chronological order of the bullet strikes, not where we started. But we also need to talk about how we did it. And Doug, of course, with his work at Little Bighorn and many other battlefields, is well versed in using modern forensic techniques and adapting them to historical use. So he turned me on to Luke Hagg's book on shooting incident reconstruction, which is obviously all about modern forensic studies and trying to figure out who did what. And we started to adapt those techniques to historical use. So we're going to talk about some of that now. The first bullet hole happened just after the fight at the North Bridge. As the British were retreating back towards Concord Center, there was a house on the left-hand side of the road, which you guys drove by in the bus, the Elisha Jones house. And now, at the time, this section of the house was not attached to it. There was a shed which was off to the left of this image and then was moved up in 1865 and attached to the house. But on April 19th, a British soldier retreating, going past it, fired a shot at the house, and it hit right next to the window there. And here's an image of Margaret Thornton, a Concordian in 1934, pointing to that image. But as a kid, I grew up with the young kid who lived in the house, and he was my best friend. So we got to run around and play in there, and I always sat there and played with a bullet hole and thought how cool it would be to figure out if it was real. And here I am as an adult or grown-up, actually doing that, which is really neat. You know, it was like 50 years ago. I was playing in that building, and now we're playing with it in a different way. So here's the actual bullet hole today, and if you go up, it's a private residence. It's owned by the Park Service, but you can see it from the road. But if you go by, you can see this little plexiglass triangle, and they covered up the hole to keep it protected. But it is .71 caliber based upon the architectural historian's historic structure report for the Park Service. With the plexiglass, we couldn't get a good reading on it. And you can see on the back side where it blew through the paneling or the sheathing, and that 2x4 or brace on the left side was replaced in 1865. So that's not an original piece. And they had taken a chisel and gouged it out so you could see the bullet hole. So that was replaced when the shed was moved up. But if you look at this image, you can see the original feather edge sheathing with a white arrow. And then on the right, you can see where that feather edge sheathing blew out. Now, how do you test to see if that really happens? You got to shoot it. So we had 18th century house sections reproduced using original materials. And we set up a couple of range days and with high-speed cameras and captured all the footage. So here's us shooting that. You can see that big chunk blow out the back. And here's the back side. You can see to the left of the image a frozen Stuart Mowbray. Standing there watching. Yeah, he wasn't too happy. It was really cold that day. You can see the look on his face. But you can also see where it blew out. You can see the bullet hole here, but it hit near a knot. So the wood where the knot was really hard, and it blew a bigger chunk out, but you can see where it blew the feather edge sheathing right out. So as the British retreated from Concord, they get to Merriam's Corner, and the provincials start to attack them again, and the fighting becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. And as they get down to Lexington, past Parker's Revenge, there's a spot called Fisk Hill. And there, a guy named James Hayward, a 25-year-old school teacher from Acton, Massachusetts, stopped purportedly to get a drink at the well. And as he was trying to get that drink, a British soldier was looting the Fisk house, came out, and they both fired at each other. The British soldier fell dead, and James Hayward was mortally wounded. Now, That story has morphed through the 19th century, that they had a conversation, you're a dead man and so are you, and both fired at each other. There was nobody there other than those two. And the first mention of it is in the newspapers on April 23rd, and it says, Mr. James Howard, they misspelled his name, which is common, and one of the regulars discharged their pieces at the same instant, and each killed the other. But Rebecca Fisk, who lived in that house, had taken her elderly father-in-law away from the house to safety, and came back after she heard the fighting had passed. And she left an account in 1827. And it's very long and it's great, but here we're just going to take the Hayward part. The third was a young American employing his dying breath in prayer. A bullet had passed through his body, taking off in its course the lower part of his powder horn. The name of this youthful patriot was James J. Hayward of Acton. His father came and carried his body home. It now lies in Acton graveyard. So in the 1980s, I knew there was a portrait of Rebecca Fisk that survived and had been sold by Grogan Auctions in Boston, but I never knew where it went. And last February it appeared, like right before Stewart was going to publish the book, which was great. And if you look at this wonderful picture of Rebecca Fisk, up in the corner, it's a picture within a picture. And that event on April 19th was so important to her that inside that picture is James Hayward and the British soldier shooting at each other by the well. So we were, luckily Sturbridge Village bought it, and we were able to get the image right before Stewart put it to print. But most importantly, and this is one of the most poignant artifacts of April 19th, bullet-struck artifacts, or any artifacts, is James Hayward's horn. So he was shot through his powder horn. The hole is .70, so it's consistent with the British musket. It blew the original plug out when he was hit. And then you can see from Stewart's great photography, the other side where those big jagged fragments blew out, and you can see that crack. So the horn was taken back to Acton by his father and given to James Hayward's brother Stevens, who then passed it down to his son Stevens, who was a Mass politician. He's the one who added the silver band and the plug to it. And then it was donated to the Acton Memorial Library. So we were able to study it. The Museum of the American Revolution borrowed it, and it was on display down there for a little while, which is great to get it out of Acton where other people can actually see it. But, you know, in order to better understand it, what are you going to do? Shoot one. So this was going to be a hard thing because windage, smooth bore, a powder horn. How are you going to hit this thing? Well, luckily we had a friend who's a professional archaeologist and a pretty damn good shot. And we set him up with it because I didn't want to be the one to fail. And he hit the horn, and look at that ballistics gelatin jump. And it's awful. But we also had cloth samples, so we had coat material, lining material, waistcoat material, lining material, and shirt material, so that we'd see what happened when we dissected the ballistics gelatin. It was a horrific, horrific wound. And we brought it back to my house, and with another thing we'll talk about later. And to the horror of my wife, we started like cutting things apart in the kitchen. And this is what came out of the ballistics gelatin for the wound. So you can see the bits of cloth, all the horn fragments that went into would have gone into the wound also. And in this case, the musket ball split when it hit the horn. Obviously, we don't know if that happened to Hayward or not. But the other thing that survives are a lot of petitions for losses for those who had damage on April 19th caused by the British or the battle. And the Fisk House petition still survives in the state. And these are the things that the British had looted out of the house. And one window was broken, one sash window also. But they listed everything that was taken. So the British then passed down Concord Hill into Lexington Center, towards Lexington Green again, which they had passed and fired on the provincials in the morning. They went right back through the same location. But this time they were moving as fast as they could, trying to get back to Boston. And the Merritt Monroe House was directly to the south of Lexington Green, kind of where you guys parked the buses during the tour. The house is like right next to where the bus was. And you can see it in this great Amos Doolittle detail. And here's the house today. It's had many additions to it. It's privately owned, but I was able to get into the house and find some of the bullet strikes that I had heard about. A shot was fired from the backyard, went through the window, up into the garret rafter, and it stuck into a post. And it was, like many of the holes were plastered over. You can see it right here. That little round hole, and at the top there's a little V where it looked like something was gouged out. Well, that musket ball that we looked at the beginning is the one that was gouged out of that beam. And I didn't know when, because the Historical Society didn't know until I found a newspaper article. And again, a lot of what we were doing, we were using a lot of newspaper searches to see if we could find new interesting information. But this newspaper article from 1915 mentions inside the workmen found 2 bullet holes, one on the right of the front door and the other in the roof. In the latter case, the bullet was traced to where it had embedded itself in a heavy timber. Apparently, both shots were fired in the Battle of Lexington. The other ones are gone that were in there now, but luckily that was saved when they redid the house. They boxed in that center rafter so you can still see where the plaster was. And again, like many of the others, there was a lot of damage done to the house, and Merritt Monroe put in for his losses. But then a few months ago, I found another document which says that Merritt Monroe also lost a gun and a hat that were taken from him. So I don't know whether the British soldiers took it from him on Lexington Green, but either way, he lost a gun and a hat. He put in for £2, 8 shillings, and he received £2, 2 shillings. So they kind of undercut him a little bit. But diagonally across from the Merritt Monroe house is Buckman Tavern, which you guys were right near the other day. And from about where I took this image, a British soldier on the retreat fired a shot and hit the front door. And the front door survives, and you can see the ballistics rod right down here. We could basically figure out, that's how we figured out the angle of where the shot possibly came from. But here's the exit hole, and it is consistent with being fired from a British musket. And you can see this typical wood blowout that you see from these shots, kind of round at the entrance, but all blown out in the back. And that had been filled with plaster, and the door had been reused. So at that point, I thought we had seen all we could at Buckman Tavern, and then I found this newspaper article that mentioned Reverend Caleb Stetson, who lived in Buckman Tavern in the mid-19th century, had died. And it mentioned that the house had a bullet hole in a clapboard. So I reached back out to Lexington, and they went, oh yeah, we do have one more thing. They have a clapboard from Buckman Tavern with a bullet hole in it, which again is consistent with a British musket. So just to the east of Lexington Center, Lord Percy came with his relief of 1,000 men and 2 6-pound guns. And that changed how the battle was going to be fought. The column up until that point had almost been completely captured, and it would have been if Percy didn't show up, the British column. However, Percy did arrive in time to save those guys, and things changed, as Reverend William Gordon wrote. But a little on this side, Lexington Meeting House, where they were met by the brigade with cannon under Lord Percy, the scene changed. So at that point, when Percy showed up, they started to burn buildings and destroy more property than they had before. Initially, they're trying to get back to Boston. Now, the relief has showed up, and they're pissed off. So they're burning structures. They're killing anything indiscriminately. You can't blame them. They're being attacked. And so the scene, as he says, the scene changed, and it gets extremely vicious. And here's this great Amos Doolittle engraving, which shows the fighting. You can see Percy and Lieutenant Colonel Smith meeting on horseback. There's a cannon on the hill over here. These are Smith's forces going towards Percy's, and Percy's coming in and burning all the structures. When Percy arrived, he took the Monroe Tavern just to the east as his headquarters, and stayed there for a little while to reorganize the forces before they formed up and moved back. And there were a few bullet holes in this house, but they're gone now, except for one in the taproom ceiling that may have come in through the window from outside and struck the ceiling. And it's been carefully preserved since 1775. But with the broken up plaster, it's very hard to measure and see if it actually was a bullet hole. But there's another item in this house that's wicked cool. It's wicked cool. And it's this portrait of William Munroe, the father of the William Munroe who owned the tavern. He had died in 1747. But even though he was dead, he still got shot on April 19th. A British musket ball struck the sleeve, and thankfully, this was not conserved properly. because you can see the round hole from the ball in his cuff. And William Munroe was a sergeant in the Lexington Militia Company, and Munroe lost a lot of things on that day, and you can see from the damages, the totals of the damage, that's a lot of money in 1775. So now we're moving to the east, back towards Boston, and we get into what is now the town of Arlington. It was called Menotomy, which was a village of Cambridge. And this gets a little jumbled here from the transition from computers, but Dr. Gary Milan owns a great letter from an unknown British officer of the 4th Regiment of Foot. And he describes the heavy fighting on the way back. And he says, from eagerness, you would see a party of soldiers firing at the front of a house, and another on its rear, whilst the main body were pelting away at the upper windows, by which many of our own people fell, even after they were in the house, and all the world could not prevent it. So what he's saying is the British soldiers are marching down the road. They're firing at the windows of the house from the main body. There are soldiers around the house firing at the houses. There are soldiers inside the houses. So the British are shooting some of their own men by mistake. It's just a mess. As Doug and I talk about a lot, there was a loss of command and control from first thing in the morning until they got back to Boston. And the other thing this letter talks about is, in one of those sallies, I had a very narrow escape, having a grenadier of the 5th, a soldier of ours, and a Marine killed all around me. But we soon got into the house, and I counted 11 Yankees dead in it in the orchard. One villain had 73 balls in his bag and 2 horns of powder. Now, there were 12 men killed at the Jason Russell house, which we're getting to in a minute. And there was one that was killed behind the barn, Lieutenant John Bacon, which Nick Magnello, who's not here, owns his sword that he was carrying that day. But this officer would not have seen Lieutenant Bacon killed behind the barn. So what the house that he's talking about with the orchard with these men is the Jason Russell house, which we're going to get to in a minute. So those 12 men were dragged into the kitchen and laid out on the kitchen floor. And Amos Farnsworth was a militiaman from Groton, Massachusetts. And he marched on the alarm of April 19th, but Groton didn't get the alarm in time to participate in the fight. So they were marching in right behind all the fighting. And he mentions he came to Lexington, where much hurt was done to the houses there by breaking glass and burning many houses. But they was forced to retreat, though they was more numerous than we. And I saw many dead regulars by the way. Went into a house where blood was half over shoes. The house that Amos Farnsworth is talking about is the Jason Russell house. Now there's another account from the 19th century that says Mrs. Russell, who lived in the house, came home and she said the blood was ankle deep. But more than likely, that morphed from Amos Farnsworth's account talking about what he saw when he went into the house. And here's the Jason Russell house today, which again is the home of the Arlington Historical Society. It's been added on to a little bit, and obviously it's had conservation work. But this house is one of the last ones that still has a lot of bullet strikes from that day. And we know from Gary Milan's letter that these British soldiers were inside the house and firing at it from the outside. So this is where we started the project, actually, other than the live fire ballistics stuff. And here's Doug in the downstairs parlor. And he's got a ballistics rod, and he'll soon have a laser on top of that so we can see where the shot came from. And it looks like it came from Mass Ave, from one of the troops either in the yard or on Mass Ave firing. Probably came through the window or the wall, went through the panel, and then it hit the newel post on the other side and skipped off. And you can see the gouge it left where it skipped off. And the interesting thing is with an endoscope video, you can see that it started round, fairly round, and changed to football shape before it exited and hit the newel post. And that lath and plaster is 19th or early 20th century. That's not the original, obviously. But, like all the other things, we had to shoot again. So this one, we have original wood and paneling with original 1727 dated section of plaster on the other side, because we wanted to see what it would have looked like from the shot going through the plaster. So here we have the shot going through one side. Then you can see it did this weird, both shots did this little oval shape around the bullet hole where it went through the lath. Above that shot, Upstairs in the parlor chamber, there's another shot. And this one, Doug's about to put the ballistics rod into. And when we did put the rod in, you can see the post-it right here. We didn't want to leave the laser going out onto Mass Ave in people's eyes. We figured that would be a bad thing. So we put a post-it right where the beam went through, and you can see that's Mass Ave right here, headed back towards Boston. And that's where the shot more than likely came from. And it went through the wooden panel Doug was just looking at. And on the other side of it, there was a little secret door. And I was a little too Rubenesque to get up inside of it, and I think Doug is too. But we had someone with us who could fit up in there. Mary Jane Balicki, who is a great friend and works on all the archaeology projects with us, she got up inside. And it was real tight, but she was able to get a cell phone shot of the blowout, the wood blowout here on the backside. But then we were also able to find where it reached its terminal velocity. You can see right here where it struck the attic stair riser and dropped. Now, we also gave her a presumptive lead test that she wrangled up inside, and she was able to get it, which tested positive for lead. So the great thing was with this one is nobody had ever touched it before. So we were able to get a positive for lead on that bullet strike. Another one was fired from outside on the south side of the house towards the kitchen chamber. It struck about here below the window, came through the panel, and you can see the laser beam right above it. There was a ballistics rod across the room where it went next, and the laser came down, and it's right there. And that's where the bullet had come through the inside paneling and blew the wood out, and it was filled with plaster after the event, so they could just fill it in and keep the drafts from going through. But it went across the room, struck here, came out the other side, and skipped off the ceiling. So this is a cool thing, going through and setting up the rods and laying out where all these shots went and where they came from. Downstairs in the kitchen where the bodies have been laid out, there's a cellar that went down and the stairs that went down into the cellar, and a bunch of soldiers from Beverly, Massachusetts, provincials, had hidden in the basement. And when the British got into the house, they shot through the door and they were trying to kill these guys. Now there's a 19th century account that says that Beverly fired back and killed one of the British soldiers through the door, but we don't know because the original door is missing. It was removed in 1895 and may survive somewhere. We've been trying to find it, but we couldn't. But we started to look around in there, and behind the door jamb, we found a bullet hole right here that went through the stair riser, and you can see the ballistics rod there, which is shot 3. Then there was another one that had gone through next to it. At this point, they seemed to be firing straight through the door. Then they both came out, they both exited the stair risers here. So you can see the wood blowout. And then would have gone into the lath and plaster on the other side of the wall. A place that the Historical Society had never looked was the attic. And up by the attic window, we found 2 bullet strikes. A lot of the sheathing around it had been replaced. So we couldn't find anything else up there, but around this window we did. And one we almost missed, because it's an 18th century house and it's so dark, is this newel post going up the stairs. I thought originally it was a peg for the handrail, but it was not. There was another bullet, a British soldier down the stairs fired his gun. It struck there, and it almost came out the other side. And it must have been pried out and then filled in with plaster, because it was a really thick oak newel post. Now, one of the other things we wanted to do was use other modern methodologies. And we had a great archaeologist with us, Meg Waters, who had done the Parker's Revenge Project, and Joel Dukes, who's sitting here, was there to get ideas of other things we could do. There were people who had said that Jason Russell House was moved, and that would affect our ballistics, where the shots are coming from. So we wanted to figure that out, and we could find no accounts of it being moved. But we also got free 3D laser scanning. So this enabled us to look around the site, figure out what was going on, and get scans, which also enabled us to get this really cool cutaway. So you can see the house, and remember the sheathing I was talking about being replaced in the attic. On this 3D scan, you can see all that. That's all replaced. But you can see the rooms, very cool. But this is the coolest part. Here's our trajectory analysis, which shows in white all of the bullet holes. So you can see where all the shots were coming from outside and inside the house. Now here's the one going up the stairs that hit the newel post. Kitchen shots, the first shot, attic. You know, it's really cool to see that where all the shots came from. Again, there were probably more, but the house had been cleaned up and altered over the years, obviously. And as far as the house being moved, we had ground penetrating radar done, which could locate any holes or any disturbances that had been done in the yard. We knew that there were houses that had been put in the early 20th century and then removed. So GSSI, who makes this equipment, actually donated a day of GPR survey for us. So they covered the whole area, and they gave us a report which tells us that the house was not moved. So that's in its original location. So the ballistics, the trajectories that Doug and I were able to do were correct, so that we knew all those shots lined up perfectly. And in the book that Stuart published for us, the GPR survey data, all of that stuff is in the appendices in the back. So there's a lot of information there. We try to include as much as possible. So now we've gone through the structures that survive, and there are relics that survive. This is a great daguerreotype of Captain William Adams' house, which is right here. And progress was coming through Arlington at the time, well, West Cambridge at the time, the railroad headed towards Lexington and Concord. So they wanted to put the railroad through. The house had to be removed. So the owner of the house took all the bullet-struck boards and bullets he could find in the house, because the house was peppered, and sold them. And he says, the owner of the estate, Mr. Josiah Russell, takes pains to secure every bullet found in the building and disposes of them at the rate of $1 each. Yesterday afternoon, a small piece of clapboard, which had been perforated by a bullet, was sold for $50. That's a lot of money in 1855. And here's one of those pieces. This is in the collection of the Arlington Historical Society, but it's one of the bullet-struck boards from the Captain William Adams house. And this is one of the door panel sections. And it says, front door panel of the Captain William Adams House, Arlington, pierced by a British bullet, April 19, 1775. Looking at the size of that hole, that's from a fowling piece. Here's another great image of it from the 19th century. They also have a loose bullet, which was in this glass jar, which took a while. The cork was stuck in it. We had to take a pin and a couple pins and trying to get the cork out to get the bullet out. But again, this could be it's heavily damaged. It could have been a British, but more than likely provincial. This great newspaper mentions that, you know, depending on which side of the house you got the bullets from, you could either get British or provincial bullets. And one of the things I found in the basement of the Arlington Historical Society, which I never knew about, behind a shelf, were shutters that had come out of some of the houses in Menotomy or Arlington today. And this one was struck by a bullet, went through the lower part of the panel right there. And then here's the exit where it blew out the thinner wood down below. It had a great tag on it. Shutters taken from the Amos Whittemore house, which stood at the site of the Florence, Mass. Ave. Bullet hole showing where the British fired into the house as they retreated April 19. Amos Whittemore did not live in the house in 1775, but we were able to figure out who did. So we know that there's an account, actually, of the woman who was in the house when that house was shot up. And she talked about the shutter. Then we found another one with a bullet hole. You can see the entrance here and the exit there. And then we found a few more on here that had been filled with plaster. So they basically plastered the hole shut and then reused the shutter again. So what are you going to do? Shoot a shutter. So we had a 19th century reproduction of an 18th century shutter we got from the Concord Museum. And we shot that, and we basically kind of recorded the damage. We didn't hit it on the panel, which we can always do again because we're still doing more shooting. But you can see the entrance and the exit. And so the next part of it, this was also, wasn't part of our book, but we wanted to recreate this shot because of its importance. And it's John Robbins, who was from Lexington, and he was on Lexington Green in the morning. And he was formed up with Captain John Parker's company. And when Parker ordered them to retreat, he turned and possibly was crouched down when the British fired. And I knew he was wounded because he shows up in the papers and I had seen his name. He's right at the top, John Robbin's here. But like the rest of the list, you don't know what happened to him. You know, it's how badly was he wounded? How did it affect his life? And through all the Mass Archives research I had been doing, I found a series of petitions written by him and his doctors through the entire war. And basically it stated that your petitioner was on the memorable 19th of April, 1775, most grievously wounded by the British troops in Lexington by a musket ball which passed by the left of the spine between his shoulders through the length of his neck, making its way through and most miserably shattering his under jawbone, by which unhappy wound your petitioner is so much hurted in the muscles of his shoulder that his right arm is rendered almost useless to him in this business. And by the fracture of his underjaw, the power of mastication is totally destroyed. And by his low slop diet, weakness and total loss of his right arm, and the running of his wound, his situation is rendered truly pitiable. So he was really screwed up. And he had 4 kids at the time and a wife. And in 1778, he had another kid, a 5th kid. But this poor guy had no way to support himself, no underjaw, couldn't eat. And so Doug and I talked about how we could try and replicate this shot. And of course, in Doug's work, he knew of ballistics gelatin, a head and torso with bone simulant. And what I didn't realize at the time was it has blood in it, fake blood. So it's kind of gross. But anyway, this is a slide of I called him John, sitting on the kitchen counter, lining up the shot, myself with a ramrod trying to kind of get the right angle. And then Jay Waller, our archaeologist friend shooter, you can see all the cameras set up. And we put a little mark, a little X with a Sharpie on where we wanted to try and get him to hit. And again, with windage and everything else, we figured there's no way he's going to do it. But he did, and this is pretty rough, but in slow motion. I mean, it was an awful, awful shot. Yeah, it's pretty bad, pretty bad. And it was pretty bad afterwards too, because when we got back to the house, and again, we took this and brought it into the house to dissect it, my wife got to see fake blood all over the house, and yeah, it was pretty gross, pretty gross. But Doug basically took all the bone simulant out, and you can see in his image over here the lower jaw and the fragments that he was able to get out. Obviously, there was a lot of small ones we couldn't, and then he reassembled the best he could. Do you want to say anything about that while you're here?
The bullet, whether or not this is a precise replication of your petitioner is much hurted. This guy was much hurted as well. It blew out the gonial angle on the right side. By the way, the ball did not enter on the left side, it entered on the right, based on the later account in the petitions. And it did strike just below, or right of the spine, went up the neck, struck the lower jaw, but also fractured the parietal, temporal, and zygomatic area of the skull, at least in the replication. And then we never found all the parts, or couldn't put all the parts back together for that lower gonial angle, the backside of the jaw. So this guy was really screwed up.
Yeah, yeah, he was. And because we got to move along here, the conclusions are for the John Robbins part of it. The other conclusions you'll see in the book. If you don't have it, I think Stuart has some copies set up in the display room. But the live fire validation study resulted in the lower jaw of the ballistics gelatin bust being shattered into more than 30 pieces. The skull around the right eye orbit, as well as the, what is it? Parietal, thank you. And temporal bones of the skull also suffered significant damage. So yeah, we believe that this is a good approximation of what happened to him. And it really enables you to better understand how bad some of these wounds were. And we can't spend a lot of time on Robbins, but I have a whole ton of petitions from him and his doctors. And he vanishes in about 1790. And he was so poor that there's no gravestone. We don't even know where he's buried at this point. The town of Lexington has no clue. But anyway, onto a happier note, the book is available from Mowbray Publishing, shameless plug, and there are some copies left. I know some of you have some already, but we want to thank everybody, especially the American Society of Arms Collectors Foundation. We were able to get, or Doug was able to get, a grant that covered his travel and some of the other stuff that we needed to do a lot of that live fire stuff. Now, granted, we can't use the video in the book, but we can use the video for presentations, and it's great to help people get a better understanding of the battle damage that survives, but also the people and their story. So hopefully, I didn't put everybody to sleep. Project, you awake? Okay, all right. Just checking, just checking. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
There's a question about the petitions for compensation.
Yeah.
Why did they feel that the province of Massachusetts owed them anything? Were they thinking of getting redress from the British government?
Well, part of it is political, so it depends on which ones you're talking about. The government of Massachusetts wanted the battle damage stuff because then they could say, look at what happened. The British did this to us. So that was for a lot of it for propaganda purposes. On the John Robbins end of things, they didn't have a VA. They had no way to take care of themselves. So this poor guy had no income, 4 kids with a 5th on the way, and no way to support himself. So the wounded guys were actually able to put in for some monies and get it until after the revolution, and then they got it from the federal government.
Right.
So in the early 19th
People
century.
who lost things from their homes.
They were paid out. They were paid out by the state.
They really were.
Yeah, yeah. But again, they did those petitions right after the event, but in 1783 they did another set. And what they really wanted to show was, we did nothing wrong, look what they did to us. You know, it was all them and not us.
I have a question about the muzzle energy of the weapons used. I'm unfamiliar with the conventional British arms that were used here. But I'm really amazed about the level of damage they could create. Do you have any idea about the muzzle energy of some of these weapons?
Yeah, we do. However, when you're talking about, like I talked about windage in the beginning, there's a huge range. They vary, the quantity of powder, how much powder goes in, how much windage there is. You know, we've got numbers, but are those numbers, you know, it's not like we shoot a Lee Enfield #1 and it's 2,300 feet per second, you know? And that's a pretty good, you know, you could say maybe 2,400, 2,300. But when we're doing this, it's all over the place, 845 feet per second, 900.
Yeah, I think the muzzle velocity recorded via high-speed photography and Doppler radar on the British 1756, or the Brown vessels in general, ranged from 750 feet per second low to over, well, I think we had one 950, and then we had some other firearms, the provincials would go up over 1,100. Now, in some of the Graz Austrian studies, which were all done in very controlled circumstances using electrical matches to fire them, they were and large quantities of gunpowder. They were getting 1,500 feet per second because that was recorded in some document that they had. They were able to achieve that, but they were using almost 200 grains of powder. My shoulder's gonna take that.
Yeah.
And they were just firing with barrels. It was locked down, not even guns. So yeah, they can achieve 1,500 feet per second if you overload them. But I think ours were very consistent. We were using Swiss gunpowder, double F. So it's modern powder too. We do the things we can't control for a lot of variables like moisture, humidity, temperature. But you know, I think we got a lot of good data, and somebody can use it. It's all in the reports that are on the ASAC website under research and I've forgotten what the other level is. But
yeah, the other thing, as Doug started to mention, which you can see in the papers that are on the American Society site, we weren't shooting for accuracy when we were doing this stuff. We were shooting to collect the data, you know, the muzzle velocities and everything. But one of the things that we realized was that the fouling piece, I have three fouling pieces, but I had one that we fired with a 55-inch barrel and a .62-inch bore. And the muzzle velocity on that gun was upwards of 1,200 feet per second compared to the others. So, and it was also hitting a target at 100 yards, a torso-shaped target. So that 55-inch barrel, smaller bore, had a much higher velocity and was much more accurate in our study than firing the pattern 56.
Was it patched or using?
No. You don't. They didn't patch any of this stuff. Paper cartridge or wadding. That's it. You know, some lint or whatever. Again, you've got windage. They're not patching this stuff like a modern gun or a rifle. It's paper cartridges or tow, just to help hold the ball in place. Because again, if you don't use tow or a paper cartridge and you do this, the ball will roll right out of the barrel. You know, so you just need something to hold it in place. But they didn't patch the stuff like you would modern shooting today. And that's another thing is we get a lot of people who say, "Whoa, I get much better accuracy than you did with mine. You know, I'm using a .74-inch ball with a patch and a 75-inch bore." That's not what they did. You know, there's an order in May of 1775 for provincials or continentals, soon to be continentals, to have a cartridge that will fit down their barrel without being rammed. So even with the paper, it's supposed to be able to drop right to the breech without being rammed. That's a lot of windage.
What about buckshot or buck and ball?
So on April 19th, there are some lost petitions for guys who were wounded or killed. There's one or two that mention buckshot. All of them had ball, but a few of them had some buckshot, and I think on our projects, we've only found a couple of buckshot on our archaeology projects, and a lot of balls.
I want to interject. Paul's question was about energy, though, not about velocity. And through the calculation,
Go ahead.
the muzzle energy is recorded in those reports. I couldn't cite that chapter and verse right now.
Yeah, the muzzle energy is in there along with the velocity. But we fired so many shots, I can't remember every one of them. So, but it's in the reports.
And since Joel's cutting into my time.
Wait a minute. This is our time.
We'll be around all day.
Okay.
You can find him sitting someplace with his foot up and drinking, so you can talk to him.